A warder shoved Matteo to his knees. The chain bit into his wrists, so Father Ambrose leaned close and said, "Confess now." Fear pressed against Matteo's tongue, and the narrator noted the tremor in the condemned man's shoulders as an objective fact. Fear pushed Matteo's hands to the worn wood of the kneeling bench. Fear made his jaw work around words that would cost him everything. The room smelled of old wax and iron. The cold wick guttered above them, and a thin thread of soot traced the lip of the candle. The narrator recorded the scene with the same steady cadence used for tax rolls and burial registers. He described Matteo's rope-bound wrists, the bruise blooming along the left cheek, and the way the thin rosary hung from Matteo's fingers with one bead missing. The chamber itself mattered only as it affected what would happen next. The bench held his weight, the ledger lay open on the scribe's table, and the iron grate beyond the altar waited. Those physical details framed the conflict. The clergy demanded words that would be set to ink and used. Father Ambrose set his palm on Matteo's shoulder in a move the narrator marked as ritual and not comfort. "Matteo," the priest said, voice low and careful, "you will speak now. We have an order to keep, and your words will set you free from sin." Ambrose's fingers pressed briefly into Matteo's flesh. Matteo flinched. Matteo answered in a voice that broke. I don't know what to say." He folded his hands around the broken bead as if it might hold him upright. That admission shifted the room. Where authority sought compliance, a small, human gap opened. Edda, the scribe, unrolled the stained ledger and set her quill near the page. Her hands were steady until she read the rubric. Then her fingers paused over the leather. The central problem was visible within these first moments. The church required confession written and recorded. The record would determine whether Matteo lived or died. Matteo faced not only punishment for alleged crimes, but the prospect that a formalized confession, once sealed, would be used to erase ambiguity. That ledger would translate stammered words into a permanent claim. The narrator noted every movement without moralizing, a duty of documentation, a duty of power. Edda dipped her quill in ink and looked at Father Ambrose. "State your name for the record," she said, voice clipped as ink scraped the rim of the inkwell. Her role was simple and precise: transcribe, seal, preserve. She wrote Matteo's name as he said it, and then wrote the date according to the clerk's hand used by the diocesan bureau. The first emotion shift arrived as Matteo tried to steady his voice and instead let something else fall out. He used the name of a man not charged in court and spat a claim that made Ambrose's jaw tighten. "You know what Luca did, Matteo? You saw him in the cellar when they brought the boy." The priest's practiced calm faltered. A flicker crossed Ambrose's face that the narrator catalogued as a moment where ritual control slipped into personal alarm. Ambrose recovered his ritual cadence. "Silence," he said to Matteo, then louder to Edda. "Record only the confession, not accusations." His hands folded and then, deliberately, he reached for a small iron-bound rosary at his waist. The motion put pressure on Matteo. The effect was clear. Power was not merely spoken, it was performed with objects that anchored the ritual. Matteo had not intended to name names. His voice crumbled as soon as it left his mouth. Agents in the room reacted differently. Edda looked at the ink smudge on the ledger and then at Ambrose. Ambrose's nostrils flared. He did not touch the ledger, but his hand tightened on the rosary until the metal clicked. The narrator wrote down each click like a ledger entry itself. A second emotion shift moved through the condemned. Doubt became terror. Matteo tried to pull his hands close to his chest as if to hide the name he had given, but the rope held his wrists apart. "Matteo, Ambrose, softer. Think of your soul. Speak the truth and the Lord will take you." The priest's tone pushed on the same lever the warder had used. Insistence that the only path required Matteo's cooperation. Ambrose began the formal series of questions. Edda scratched as she recorded the standard formula: transgression, motive, accomplices, plea. The ledger's lines accepted each word like a machine. Matteo answered in short bursts. "I carried the crates," he said once. "I saw them lower the child into the cellar." His sentences were fragments. The room filled with sound and evidence. A warder shifted his weight near the door, bringing a metallic creak. Ambrose leaned forward. He invoked relics in a measured cadence, names of saints, the presence of a bone, the blessing that accompanied the church's authority. The relics were not described as mystical but as instruments of pressure. A burn, scarred reliquary placed on the table, a vial of odor that made Matteo cough. Edda noted the cough in the margin. Edda's eyes caught a smudge in the ledger as she copied Matteo's words. The smear was darker than fresh ink, a crossing out, as if someone had altered the page earlier. She paused, lifted her chin, and whispered to Ambrose. This line, someone crossed it. Her whisper interrupted the ritual cadence with a new, tangible problem. Ambrose's face tightened into a precise mask. Correct it, he said to Edda, make the record clean. The office cannot be corrupted by careless hands. Edda considered the page, and then, against a small, private impulse she kept to herself, set the quill to form a careful correction. The ledger changed under her hand. Letters shifted. The narrator recorded this alteration without commentary. The ledger was being prepared to serve a purpose. The tenor of the chamber altered again when Matteo, pushed to the edge, turned his accusation into a name that implicated not only local criminals but a nearby cleric who had never stood publicly accused. Father Ambrose, Matteo blurted, his voice raw. You were at the manor when the boy was brought. You signed for the oil. Be silent. The words slapped the ritual into a different shape. Ambrose's hand smoothed the edge of his vestment as if to flatten the trimmer they had seen. A rapid exchange followed. Father Ambrose, Matteo, you lie. Matteo, I am not lying, Edda. Write exactly what he says, Father Ambrose. We will not drag names without proof. The narrator noted each line of dialogue as a piece of record, like entries in the ledger. These short sentences were the instrument of change. They formed the pressure that would either break Matteo or shift the outcome. An external event occurred. A second warder returned with a sealed wax pouch marked by the diocesan sign. He placed it on the table near the ledger and did not speak. The arrival of the pouch registered like a new clause in the ritual. Papers had come to authorize or confirm something beyond the chamber's immediate account. The pouch contained orders, and once opened it would change what the ledger meant. Ambrose read the impressed seal without breaking it. His fingers tapped the table. Edda, he said, note the presence of the commission. Record the seal. Edda pressed the wax with her thumb and then touched her ringed fingers to the leather, making a small print in the margin as proof. The ledger accepted the impression. The room bureaucratized the moment. The narrator followed the beats toward escalation. Ambrose's ritual gestures increased. He took a bone-handled stylus, traced a line above Matteo's confession, and intoned devotional phrasing that sounded less like mercy and more like interrogation. Matteo, he said, you will speak clearly of those who aided you. He leaned so close that the candle's heat warmed Matteo's cheek. Matteo's breathing quickened. He tried to name another person but then froze, eyes searching Ambrose's face for a sign of mercy. Why should I trust you, Matteo? He spat the words like a test. Ambrose's response came as a quiet, precise counter, because truth relieves the soul. Speak and the church will record what you say. The appeal to record was the point. A confession made public in ink mattered more than a private prayer. Edda's pen faltered again when she noticed another inconsistency. A faint scrape across a prior confession 2 pages earlier. The smear matched a style she had seen in the diocesan registry, where officials erased inconvenient lines. She did not say this aloud. Instead, she folded forward and wrote, slower, deliberately, making sure each letter could be traced back. A mid-chapter twist happened when Matteo, under pressure, named a local bailiff who had once carried crates to the manor. The name forced Ambrose to flinch in a way the narrator took down like a witness statement. That flinch opened a tiny, dangerous gap. The priest's composed authority had a visible seam. The room's balance shifted. Edda stopped pretending the ledger was a neutral thing. Ambrose abandoned the formal tone for a moment and reached forward. He gripped Matteo's jaw and forced his mouth open to shape a word. Say it properly, Ambrose ordered. Say what you did and who stood with you. The action was sudden and violent inside the ritual frame. Hands tightened around bone and rope. Matteo's eyes rolled. Saliva gathered at the corner of his mouth. A rapid dialogue exchange followed with 3 sharp turns. Matteo, Ambrose, name them now. I, Matteo choked. Luca. The bailiff, the cellar. I saw, no more evasions. Ambrose snapped. We will write what you say. Edda's quill moved faster. She kept her head down and the ledger steady. The narrator wrote the moment as both evidence and turning point. The priest had turned physical to obtain inked words. The climax arrived when Ambrose pressed Matteo's face to the bench and forced him into a voice that had no room for hesitation. Matteo's lips formed the final lines that would be set to ink. The priest's hand closed at his throat for a second, an act the narrator noted with sterile precision, a seizure of control. Matteo's breath came thin and fast. His voice, when it came, was a string of names and actions that would not be easy to undo. Edda hesitated only once. She glanced at the smudge she had noticed earlier, then at the sealed pouch on the table, and then at Ambrose. Her hesitation cost her nothing and everything. She dipped her quill, wrote the words exactly as forced, and then, with nails that betrayed her trimmer, pressed the hot wax seal onto the leather page. The wax set. A small blackened stamp imprinted the official hand on Matteo's confession. Matteo slumped back as if the words had released a weight he did not choose. The warders moved in to test his limbs and found them slack. Ambrose stepped away from the bench and adjusted his robe. He did not look at Edda when she closed the ledger. The narrator described each micro-movement, the rosary falling slightly askew, the flicker of the candle as a draft passed, the way the warder's boot scraped the stone. The aftermath unfolded with clerical efficiency. Ambrose instructed the warders to prepare Matteo for removal, a phrase that in this context meant the march toward execution. Bind him for the cart, Ambrose. Take him to the east gate before dawn. The instruction removed ambiguity. The ledger now served as the legal instrument to carry out an order. Edda watched the warders lift Matteo. She had written his words with her own quill, and the ink now sealed a path to his fate. She placed the quill in its case and tapped the wax with a seal she had reserved for official corrections. For the narrator, that tap was a fact to record, not an act to judge. Still Edda's fingers remained ink-smudged. She rubbed them on her tunic to erase the evidence of her part. An unexpected reveal changed how earlier actions read. When a warder reached into his pouch to fetch the writ for the cart, the narrator noticed a second document folded inside, a note in a hand that matched an earlier blotch in the ledger. That parallel suggested that previous entries had been rewritten to fit a later script. The presence of this matching hand made the chamber's ritual appear as much an act of administration as sanctimony. Ambrose arranged Matteo on the stretcher and touched the man's forehead quickly with a rough sign of blessing. May God receive what you have confessed, Ambrose. His voice now returned to ritual and less to command. The warders moved Matteo toward the door. The ledger lay closed on the table with the wax seal still warm. Outside the chamber, a heavy iron latch scraped as hands prepared to swing the door open. The narrator recorded the scrape and, as part of the final registry of the scene, wrote that Ambrose lingered a moment by the ledger, smoothing the leather with a fingertip. He did not look at Edda again. The chapter ended not with philosophizing but with a situation. The warders carried Matteo toward the iron door. Edda folded the quill into its case, and Ambrose slipped the rosary back under his vestment. The narrator closed his own leather-bound ledger and made a single-line entry. Confession sealed, order issued, prisoner removed. A hand turned the iron latch from the outside, and the chamber door swung inward on its heavy hinge. The final line is a concrete action. The latch clicked shut as the warders moved Matteo into the corridor, and the candle guttered one last time as the room's light receded to shadow. Father Ambrose struck the iron, bound rosary against Matteo's shoulder and said, "Confess the name." The warder tightened the rope at Matteo's wrists until the skin whitened. Fear moved Matteo's tongue before his mind had finished naming the danger. He swallowed and spat a single consonant into the quiet. The narrator recorded the sound of the syllable as if it were evidence. Fear dictated Matteo's first responses. He kept his head low and mouthed the syllables like a man reading a debt notice. He did not refuse because refusal would bring more than punishment. It would break a chain of protection he still half hoped existed. The conflict in the room was simple and absolute. A priest demanding a ledger, a scribe poised with ink, a condemned man whose single word could topple another's life. The kneeling bench scraped when Matteo shifted. Father Ambrose leaned forward and pressed the crucifix into the hollow above the condemned man's breastbone. He did not speak a prayer, name him. Father Ambrose, name him now. The priest's voice was steady, ritual-toned. Matteo's jaw trembled. Sweat made the rope slip, and the warder cursed and tugged it tighter. The narrator noted each movement without pity. He had watched the first session, when the warder had shoved Matteo down and the chain had cut into his wrists. That earlier moment had left a fresh bruise along Matteo's cheek. This repetition mattered. The ledger did not take pleas. It only took names and dates and short, clean confessions. Matteo's mouth forced the name out like a stone. Bartolo, he said. The single word landed in the room like a small stone dropped into dark water. Father Ambrose's eyes narrowed. He released the rosary and tapped a finger on his lip. Silence followed that measured contact. Edda unrolled the ledger. Her fingertips were stained with old ink. She had copied confessions before and sealed them with the same careful hand. She had also noticed discrepancies when clerks doctored phrasing to serve a patron. Tonight, the page caught her eye immediately. A dark smear stood in the margin, not in her hand, and beneath that smear someone had scratched a brief line that contradicted the formal charge. Edda's fingers hovered over the quill. She hesitated because the ledger mattered. The ledger turned confession into law. Altering it could save a life or end one. This hesitation was Edda's first moral action in the chamber. She considered changing a phrase to keep a name from being weaponized. Her pause made Father Ambrose look up. Edda, Father Ambrose, tight as wire, record the name as spoken. Yes, Father, Edda answered, and her voice was practical and small. She dipped the quill and kept her hand deliberate. She had learned to move slowly so her motions could be watched and measured without betraying intent. Tension rose because the name Bartolo did not fit the official accusation. Matteo's charge had been petty theft at first hearing. Bartolo was a local patron, a man whose money built a wing of the hospital and paid a few key warders. Naming him changed the frame. It turned a single condemned body into a possible instrument against a patron and the institutions that depended on his coin. Father Ambrose folded his hands and tilted his head. He produced a small ornate crucifix and set it between himself and Matteo like a judge setting a gavel. You have a duty to the truth, he said. He spoke the phrase not as explanation but as a weapon. The warder tightened the rope once more. Matteo blinked. His eyes landed on Edda's hand. He took the boy into the cellar. Matteo, voice breaking into short beats. Bartolo took him. He me to bury the ledger where no one would check. His sentences came in fragments. He pulled at the rope until it bit closer into his flesh. The room shifted. Edda's pen stilled, then scratched. The smear in the margin looked like blood. She leaned closer and read the smudged words aloud to herself, so the words would commit to her memory, ledger to be hidden under the floorboard of the third room. She the phrase without punctuation. Each syllable anchored itself. Father Ambrose did not show surprise. Instead he drew a thin strip of parchment from his robe and glanced at the smudge. He sniffed it as if testing a relic. The priest's face did not change, but his fingers tightened on the crucifix. If true, justice will measure him. The meaning was clear. The ledger would enable a prosecution that would reach Bartolo. Edda felt doubt press against her ribs. Doubt arrived after fear and before a different motion. It was the thought that her hand could rewrite a life. She tested the quill's tip against her thumb and considered altering the phrasing to say the assault was a rumor, to change the place, to soften the weight of the accusation. Each slight change would be a lie. Each omission would be a mercy. She had to choose. She changed one word, not a name, not an alibi. She adjusted syntax to avoid a direct charge. The movement was microscopic. It was a hand deciding to delay a blade. Father Ambrose noticed the delay. Do you change the sacred record, Edda? He asked. I write what I hear, Father, Edda replied. Her voice tightened. She kept her shoulders square, but the pause in her breath could be heard. That exchange began a short flare of argument. Warders shuffled. The warder nearest Matteo, "Keep still. Keep still and speak true." He used Matteo's given name to drag the man back into the room's center. "Matteo, say all of it. Say where the ledger was kept." The word "say" was a demand and a measuring stick. Matteo spat a wet sound and answered, "In the cellar, behind the wine barrels. Bartolo, he told me to hide it with the floorboards near the pillar." His voice held a new clearness, as if speech had relieved a throttle. He started to name another detail, a direction in the cellar, and then stopped at a sound from the corridor. Someone knocked at the outer wooden door twice, a blunt, urgent rap. The narrator added the rap to his list of facts. Edda looked across the table and saw Father Ambrose's jaw tight. The knock was an external event that forced movement. An unexpected arrival. The warder opened the door a crack. A young clerk stood on the threshold, eyes wide. "A messenger, Father," he said. He handed in a sealed note and then stepped back as if keeping his distance from whatever decisions the room made. Father Ambrose broke the seal with a fingernail and scanned the words. He did not smile. He read aloud, "Bartolo is in the hall. He requests counsel. He will speak with the magistrate at first light." The line landed like a new condition. The ledger's stain now had a direct line to a man who moved in corridors, who could countermand decisions with coin and friends. The room recalibrated. Fear shifted into calculation. Father Ambrose set the crucifix down and studied Matteo as if the condemned were a ledger to be balanced. "If Bartolo comes," he said, "then the public record must stand unbroken. Edda, the wording will be exact." His tone closed the question. Edda's hand trembled in controlled increments. She now felt an urge not to protect Bartolo, but to protect a boy's body that was implicated in Matteo's words. Doubt gave way to an internal decision. She would hide a single notation in plain sight and slip the torn corner elsewhere. She would not risk full falsification, but she would preserve an unaltered trace. "Edda, Matteo," and the name was a plea. "Please. They will find him. They will." His sentence broke. He closed his fingers around the rope and ground his teeth. "Matteo," Father Ambrose answered, cold and exact, "you will give the full account on this page. Speak clearly and sign with your hand." He pushed a small iron stylus toward Matteo, as if the instrument were a contract. Matteo reached and took the stylus with a hand that shook. He pressed his name to the parchment. The quill scratched. He tried to steady his breath and to count the movements. Each stroke of the stylus registered his cooperation. His lips mouthed a line about the cellar's floorboard and the boy's hiding place. He named a second person, not Bartolo, but a servant called Ricci, a name that had not appeared in any earlier depositions. That new name tightened the net around local household dynamics. The priest did not relent. He guided the repetition of the phrases in ritual cadences. "Say it again," he instructed. "Say what you saw. Say it now." The warder moved forward with a flat palm the way a man might flatten a page to make a clean copy. An argument flared between Father Ambrose and Edda when the scribe's hand delayed at a compound clause. "Record the structure of the accusation exactly," Father Ambrose ordered. Edda replied in a clipped voice, "I am recording the words, Father, but I must mark the margin to note uncertainty." Her hand stabbed a small vertical line at the corner of the page. She did not write the caution in full. She tilted her head to Mother Church's logic, and then to Matteo's cracked face, and decided how to allocate her risk. A secondary event occurred when the messenger returned from the corridor to report a visitor's impatience. Behind him came footsteps that did not belong to warders. They were heavy, confident, and carried the echo of boots that had printed in town squares. The corridor door opened wider, and a man appeared in the threshold, wrapped in a cloak, his face set. Bartolo entered the chamber. Bartolo did not speak at first. He scanned the room, saw the ledger, and then fixed his gaze on Matteo. "So this is where you keep your confessions," he said. His voice was casual. His hands were empty but sure. He leaned against the lintel as if the room were his own home. Father Ambrose rose. He folded his robe and let the crucifix hang. "Bartolo," he said, "do you deny the charge?" "I deny being an accomplice to theft," Bartolo replied. I deny calling on young men to hide ledgers. I do not deny that I gave coin to the infirmary. I do not deny that my servants drink at my table. But I will speak with magistrates, not in the dark." His cadence was controlled. Matteo's head snapped up. He saw Bartolo, and then the warder tightened the rope around his wrists again. He put the boy in the cellar. "Matteo, he me to hide the page." He tried to point, but his arm trembled. Bartolo's smile thinned. "You accuse me of a crime I would not commit here," he said. "You make a charge in the dark and expect a man to bend. Come to court, let the magistrate hear. Do you seek justice or only spectacle?" He spoke now with public language, calibrated to other ears. The room became a contest over record and audience. Father Ambrose insisted the ledger would suffice. Bartolo insisted on formal adjudication and on witnesses. Edda watched the interplay and made another choice. She took the ledger and, under the table, with a movement quick and small, tore a single corner from the current page and folded it between her fingers. That private theft occurred while the others argued. The narrator logged the exact motion. A torn corner folded into a sleeve. It was not grand. It was not heroic. It was a micro-act that preserved an uncontrolled sentence outside the official book. The torn corner carried Matteo's exact phrasing, unsmoothed, unsanctioned. The argument escalated into a short flash of fast dialogue. "You cannot alter the record," Bartolo sharply. "You cannot leak accusations to ruin a household. The record will be what the record is," Father Ambrose answered. "We will not be bullied by the rich." "Then let the magistrate decide," Bartolo insisted. "Let law come in light." The three men volleyed 6 short lines, each cool down quick and precise, a rapid exchange that measured power in words. The warder snapped a command: "Enough. Either he signs or we move to execution." The statement forced a decision. The threat of immediate action compressed choices. Matteo's next movement decided the small moral line. He bent his head and wrote the final phrase, the sentence that would be sealed in wax. His hand was slow. He pressed so hard the iron stylus left tiny gouges in the page. Father Ambrose watched each stroke as a man watches a horse die. Clinical, Edda sealed the leaf with a drop of heated wax and pressed a small sigil into it. The ledger closed. That sealing felt like victory to Father Ambrose. He had won the narrative. He had the exact wording. He had the public record that could be shown to magistrates and to the houses that cared. But the torn corner rested inside Edda's sleeve like a match. Afterward, the warder removed Matteo from the kneeling bench and set him on a bench near the brazier. He pushed a cup of water toward Matteo. "Drink," he said. Matteo gulped and choked. The physical aftertaste of the ordeal was not a mood but a set of reactions, a split lip, a bruise, a hand that could not stop shaking. The narrator wrote these down. Edda retreated to her alcove and unrolled the folded corner. Her breath was steady enough to press the scrap flat. The notation on that scrap included a small line that had not survived the final sealing. The boy's name, the direction of the floorboard, and a single phrase that implied the presence of a hidden child. She thought of the boy's breath in the cellar and the way children's voices echoed differently in stone. Doubt shifted into a quiet resolve inside her. Her action would not free Matteo, but it might free the boy. She pressed the scrap under the lining of her sleeve and sat very still. The narrator observed that her choice created a future lever for change. It also created risk. She had done something that might be discovered and might cost her life or place. The chapter's small climax ended when the warder moved Matteo toward the outer door. Father Ambrose gave the final notation for the record and turned his back to the chamber as if the business had concluded. Outside, a town bell began its slow chime for the hour. The sound carried over the stone and through the low arch. That external sound marked time and ordered the next step. Edda closed the ledger and set it on the shelf. She watched Father Ambrose's shoulders for an instant, and then she walked out of the scribe alcove with a slow, measured gait. She let her fingers brush the inner fold of her sleeve where the torn corner rested. The gesture was small and definite. Matteo coughed once more and looked at Edda. "Please," he said, and his plea was a physical curl of the lips and a squeezed shut fist. "Remember the cellar?" Edda met his stare and nodded once. She did not promise grand things. She moved toward the door. Outside the corridor, a lantern burned low. The warder opened the door and led Matteo away. The narrator recorded the door's creak and the scuff of leather on stone. In the scribe alcove, Edda untied the thin scrap from her sleeve and slid it into a small case under the parchment rolls. She sealed the case and then set it between pages of a harmless supply ledger. She closed the book and returned it to its place. The act completed a chain. Public record secured, private evidence preserved. That night the chamber emptied and the ghost of conversation remained on the benches. Father Ambrose returned to his vestments and arranged his relics. He made no show of triumph. He only laid the crucifix over the ledger and said a short phrase, not a prayer but a categorical line. The record stands, the narrator wrote down the words. Edda left last. She walked behind a low brazier and paused to check the seam of her sleeve. The torn corner was still there under the flicker of her skin. Her heartbeat did not feel like metaphor. It was a pace she could count. She stepped into the corridor and walked into the pale wash of dawn light. Outside, Bartolo waited by a pillar, his cloak drawn. He did not speak. His presence signaled that the matter would not die in the chamber. He would bring his own witnesses. The ledger and the torn scrap had set two paths. One official and visible, the other hidden and potentially dangerous. The narrator closed his ledger for the night and set a leather strap across the page. He noted the exact wording of the sealed line and the action Edda had taken. He had no use for sentiment. He had a duty to record what happened and how it altered the balance of power. Before the chapter ended, a last movement occurred. A small boy's ragged shoe was glimpsed in the corridor as a servant carried in a tray. No one noticed the shoe but Edda. She saw the dust pattern on the leather and the scuff that matched Matteo's description of the cellar steps. The sight tightened her jaw. She placed a hand on the covered ledger and felt the iron of the clasp. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. Edda slipped the sealed case into a hidden shelf in the supply ledger and then locked the shelf with a simple wooden peg. She pushed the peg in with a measured thumb and walked out into daylight. The narrator recorded the peg's sound and the place of the hide. The action did not resolve the wider danger, but it changed the file of evidence and created a single point that might later open or break. That mechanical click ended the chapter. A warder shoved Matteo into the narrow alcove and slapped a fresh sheet onto the desk, ordering him to sign his name or die. Fear pressed at Matteo's throat. He breathed, felt the chain chafe the skin of his wrists, and imagined his brother's face. Fear drove his first words when Father Ambrose leaned forward, palms folded, and said, "Name them." The scribe unrolled the ledger. The problem in the room was clear. A written name would seal fate, or offer a lie that might buy a scrap of life. The narrator watched and recorded the details without pity. He noted the way Matteo's shoulders rose and fell, the cut on Matteo's lip, the rope's dark imprint across his wrists. He noted the iron-bound stylus on Ambrose's desk and the smear of old ink at the ledger's margin. The narrator's voice did not intervene. It logged. Those facts established the protagonist's circumstance. Matteo, late 20s, malnourished, forced to choose between protecting others and securing his own breath. Ambrose did not lower his eyes. He spoke in the same measured cadence he used in prayer, but he did not ask for mercy. Write it. Father Ambrose, a name on the page will be absolution. Speak it and put ink to it. The priest's hand tapped the iron rosary at his belt. The warder tightened the rope at Matteo's wrists until pale skin stood out beneath the fibers. Matteo's first emotion swing was calculation. He considered a false name. He tried to shape his mouth into a name that could divert danger away from the man who had hidden him last winter, away from the woman who had sewn his tunic. Calculation showed in Matteo's eyes as a rapid darting to the doorway, to the single slit of daylight. He stammered, Marco. He offered Marco Tessari. Ambrose's face did not change. Marco. Ambrose repeated, Marco Tessari. His voice held a prompt, not surprise. The warder stepped closer and hissed names. Now, Edda's hand hovered over the quill. Her palms bore ink smudges from pages she had copied all week. She had recorded confessions before. She had sealed names with wax. Yet she had also noticed irregular entries in recent months, marginalia in different ink, names added after seals were fastened. She rolled the ledger toward the open line and hesitated over a spattered margin. The ledger's stain matched the old ink by shape and pressure. Her second emotion shift moved from detachment to suspicion. Suspicion tightened the room. Edda leaned closer, eyes catching the faint cues. The pressure of certain strokes, the weaker flourish where names had been altered. Her finger brushed a faint addition in the margin. It read like a later hand correcting a confession to fit a narrative Ambrose wanted. She did not speak at first. She copied the letters beneath the wax seal, careful to transcribe precisely. Ambrose watched Edda as if testing the ledger as well as Matteo. He lifted the iron-handled stylus and set it on the wood between them. Matteo, Ambrose, look at the page. Sign for your soul. Name who conspired. His voice was steady, ritualizing the demand. Matteo's mouth worked. He tried to conjure more names. His calculation curdled into panic when he saw a man he had once sheltered at the market pass a window and glance inside. The sudden movement outside the slit of light broke whatever fragile diversion Matteo had planned. Panic quickened his pulse. He opened his mouth and then closed it. No, he whispered. Forgive me. He shifted his eyes to the ledger and then to Edda, pleading without words. Edda's second emotion shift arrived when she recognized an old marginal mark. Letters overwritten in a different hand that matched the style of a clerk who had recently vanished from the temple. She lifted her quill, pressed it to the page, and then paused. Her hand trembled. Her choices were specific and immediate. Copy Matteo's offered name exactly, thereby ensuring the public ledger matched Father Ambrose's authority. Or alter a single stroke to misdirect the finger that would later point at an innocent. Outside, a warder in the corridor coughed. The cough counted as an external event and raised the stakes. Ambrose's eyes narrowed. Right, he ordered. Matteo pushed his chin forward. He tasted copper. He scraped the back of his tongue over his teeth and said, I lied. Marco is not the one, it's... He stopped. He tried to call the woman's name who had taken him in, but the warder moved his foot and the pressure on Matteo's rope increased. Ambrose's hands struck the desk. The iron rosary described a short arc and thudded against the wood. Do not lie in God's presence, Ambrose, and his voice acquired the weight of law. Ambrose reached for the ledger. Edda, take his mark, exact script. He must sign as he speaks. Edda's breath left in a sharp note. Her hands were steady enough to write. She had never failed at transcription. But she also had ink on her fingertips from copying a sealed ledger that later contained additions. Her curiosity, then responsibility, became an instrument of risk. She could hide an amendment because she had the wax seal kit, and because the copy system allowed a torn duplicate to be secreted away. The narrator recorded these possibilities without assigning moral judgment. He catalogued what each actor could do. Matteo tried another tactic. He found a name that was likely to be common and thus difficult to trace. Antonio Rossi, he said, voice thin. Antonio Rossi. He forced the syllables out like a prayer. His throat worked. He watched Ambrose for a reaction. Ambrose cocked his head. Is Antonio Rossi the man who taught you? Ambrose. Matteo swallowed. No. He bought bread sometimes. He was there. I don't know. The words were small and brittle. Ambrose's jaw tightened. The priest tilted his head and then set his palm flat on the ledger as if to physically seal the page. Edda. He the name with a tone that made the responsibility immediate. Edda leaned forward and began to write. The quill scratched in a tone that felt loud in the hush. Her ink moved across the line precisely, and she formed the letters Antonio Rossi with careful penmanship. She duplicated the shaky strokes that Matteo made, making the entry believable. Halfway through the line, Edda's eyes caught a faint secondary mark beneath the fold of the parchment, a previous entry crossed out with a thin pen. And beside it 2 letters that formed the initial of a name Matteo had not spoken. The discovery served as another external event and a potential turning point. Edda paused. She had to decide in a fraction of a breath. Her third emotion shift moved from suspicion to quiet defiance. She slid her hand under the ledger and produced a small slip of ripped parchment she had hidden in her sleeve. She pressed it on the edge of the desk, palming it toward Matteo. Matteo's fingers closed on the slip. He read 3 words scrawled in a cramped hand. Not Marco, not Rossi. The message contained both a directive and a risk. Matteo's eyes flicked from Ambrose to Edda. Edda, he mouthed, raw and urgent. Ambrose's eyes blazed. He slammed the ledger aside so that ink spattered the desktop. Edda! He snapped. He seized her wrist and twisted, forcing her hand toward the page. You will mark the true name. You will not alter God's law. A rapid argument began. The exchange met the requirement for a 3-6-line quick back. And fourth, let go. Ambrose, your hand. You record confessions. Ambrose, you obey the right. You changed entries before. Edda returned. You changed names after sealing. Silence. Ambrose barked. Do not accuse me in my chapel. Then show the ledger. Edda. Show the seals you used and the inks you added. Ambrose's grip tightened. You will not speak against me here. Edda forced a reply, each line clipped and measured. I will not let you write a death sentence on a man for your convenience, Ambrose hissed. You betray your duty. You forge a priest's record. Edda's mouth was thin. I record truth unless ordered to lie. The narrator recorded the confrontation as an intersection of ritual and force. The physicality of Ambrose's hold, the rush of blood to Edda's hand where the iron stylus pressed, the sheen of sweat at Matteo's temple. Concrete details that mapped the conflict without moralizing. The warder moved in. He tried to wrench Ambrose's hand from Edda's wrist. Matteo seized the moment. He dragged his knees forward on the bench and lunged at the ledger, trying to cover the page with his body. Stop! He cried, stop! His voice cracked. The presence of this action met the rule that an external event occur every 3 to 5 paragraphs. Ambrose let go of Edda to shove Matteo back. The 2 men collided at the desk. The ledger slipped and one corner caught the candle flame. Wax dripped onto the margin and began to harden, creating a small, accidental seal over the very area Edda had pointed to minutes before. The candle swacks added a new impediment to Edda's plan. This unplanned detail altered the direction of the struggle. Edda moved with intention. She reached for her wax seal kit with her free hand and produced a thin ribbon. She jammed the ripped scrap into a folded corner of her tunic and pressed her palm against the ledger as if to keep it from slipping. Her defiance now included concealment. She had converted an incidental prop into an actionable tool. The narrator marked the moment as a pivot. The ledger would now show a sealed name and a hidden scrap would become the only counter record. Ambrose recovered and struck the desk with the iron-bound rosary. Enough! He intoned. Matteo, speak plainly. Name the chief conspirator. His voice seethed with authority. He raised the stylus like an executioner's mark. Matteo's third emotion shift moved from panic into a hard, cold resolve. He understood the ledger's function. A name on public parchment would be used at the pillory and in court. A written name could be repeated by warders, read aloud in the square, used to gather men with torches. He also knew that a false name could send the punishment to another household. His brother's picture flickered behind his eyes and his jaw clenched. A single name. Niccolo Ferri. The name was chosen because the man lived on the far side of town and kept late hours. Matteo forced the syllables cleanly. Niccolo Ferri did ask me. He gave me wine. Me too. Matteo stuttered, then gathered himself. He filled the sentence with the smallest plausible crime he could muster that would not implicate the woman who had sheltered him. Edda wrote the name. Her quill moved deliberately, and she added a faint dot in the margin in case later historians read her hands. The cotton of her sleeve brushed the ledger's edge, and she felt the wax edges where the candle had dripped. She slid the torn scrap into her palm and folded it between thumb and forefinger. Her act of concealment was precise. She would later tuck the scrap into a ledger duplicate and hide it under a loose stone in the scribe's alcove. Ambrose watched the script and then lifted his eyes to Matteo. Do you swear by God and by the cross? He asked. Matteo lowered his head. He fumbled for the thin wooden rosary he kept in his tunic and held it out like a talisman. I swear, he said in a small voice. Ambrose nodded once and placed the iron-bound stylus across the page, stabbing it swiftly to mark Matteo's seal. The stylus iron point nicked the parchment, and blood a small dot of ink that looked like a blood spot. The room took on the look of a closed liturgy. Seal, stylus, wax. The physical gesture mattered. It transformed a name into an instrument of justice. At that instant, the warder by the door opened it a crack to admit the jailer with a note. The note was an external intrusion, and it read, "Execution at noon confirmed. Bring ledger." The word ledger made every heart beat in the alcove track the object they had just sealed. It converted the act of writing into an immediate timetable. The narrator took note. The schedule collapsed the time Edda had to act. Edda slid the ledger closed with fingernails that left thin crescent marks on the corner. She palmed the ripped scrap again and tucked it into her tunic. The warder seized Matteo by the chain and began to pull him toward the chamber threshold. Matteo's eyes flicked once more to Edda and then to Ambrose. Ambrose's mouth was a thin line. "We will read this aloud in the court. The people will know his crime. The law will be satisfied." He sounded like a man reciting the final stanza of a prayer. Matteo did not answer. He allowed the warder to haul him forward. The chain rasped. As he passed the desk, he brushed his fingers against the ledger and felt the raised wax where the candle had dripped. He looked down at his hands and felt the ropes bite as a promise that the state would not slacken. In the threshold, the warder paused and then thrust a wrapped cloth back toward Edda. "Seal this copy for the archive," he said. Ambrose ordered it. He did not look at Edda. Edda's hand shook as she accepted the wrapped copy. She lifted the cloth aside and glanced at the inner sheet. The public copy bore Matteo's name in a firm hand and a fresh wax seal. Edda's hidden scrap remained secret in her palm. The narrator recorded the split record. A public ledger and a concealed account. Matteo walked away. His steps were measured under duress. He did not cry out. He did not beg. He walked like a man who had traded his speech for a bargain and then wondered at the price. The warders pushed him out of the alcove and down the narrow corridor toward the execution chamber. The sound of his chains receded. Edda sat back at the desk and closed her eyes for a breath. Her face looked drained but concentrated. She placed the secret scrap inside her quill case, wrapped it in oilcloth, and then palmed the wax seal kit under her robe. She had to choose the right hiding place before the noon reading. She had also to decide what she would risk to preserve the truth. Her position, her freedom, perhaps her life. Ambrose remained where he stood and smoothed his robes. He collected the iron-bound rosary and then draped the ledger across his forearm. He spoke without raising his voice. "The ritual works," he said. "Confession binds the soul and clears the town." His words were a claim to order. Edda answered with a low, clipped statement. "Sometimes ritual hides the will to wield power." Ambrose's eyes flashed. "Do not lecture me, Edda. You know the consequences of undermining mercy." He stepped toward the door and called to the warder, "Prepare the square." His fingers tightened around the ledger as if it were a weapon. The narrator recorded these final movements as the closing of a scene and the opening of consequences. He logged Edda's clandestine actions, Ambrose's consolidation, and Matteo's removal. The ledger would travel to the square. A name would be read aloud. A crowd would repeat it. Men would march to Niccolo Ferri's home with torches. The consequences were a chain that would snap across houses. The mid-chapter twist occurred when the jailer returned an hour later with a message for Ambrose. He bowed and wiped his palms. A man arrived at the shrine demanding to speak privately. The jailer reported. He says he witnessed the market accusation and wishes to recant. The arrival was unexpected and contradicted the immediate logic that Matteo's testimony had sealed the case. The new witness could unravel the public thread. Ambrose's face hardened. "Bring him in at once." He pushed toward the scribe's alcove as if to control the narrative. The narrator watched Ambrose pivot from ritual authority to an active manipulator of testimony. The man who entered smelled of fish and mud. He limped slightly and kept his hands raised. "I am Niccolo Ferri's brother," he said. "I was at the market. I saw the man who shook Matteo's hand. It was not Niccolo, it was a man named Marco Lupo. I can swear it." His voice was flat and urgent. Ambrose's jaw tightened. "You came late." He studied the man for signs of deceit. "Why now? Why come to me?" Ambrose's tone carried an accusation and a demand. The brother's eyes darted. I feared men who watched the market. I feared worse. I have watched Niccolo for a year. He is not the man who took Matteo. You have the ledger, Ambrose. You have sealed a name you think true. I will not let an innocent be taken. The man's words were blunt and specific. He had entered the scene as a new external event that changed the trajectory. Edda stepped forward, who wrote the marginal note that was added after the seal. She asked. Ambrose looked at her as if the question were an insult. Everything added was necessary, he hit sharply. Do not spread doubt in a sacred place. The brother turned to Matteo's absent figure. They will go at noon. The crowd is already told. I came to stop this. His hand trembled. Edda's mind raced. The arrival created a moment of possibility and danger at once. If she could produce the hidden scrap and show that Matteo had attempted to protect a different name, the scheduled execution might be delayed. If she failed, Ambrose might accuse her of forging documents. She reached inside her robe, felt the oilcloth wrapped around the scrap, and then stopped as footsteps sounded in the corridor. The narrator recorded the incoming footsteps, other warders returning with the public ledger wrapped for the archive. Time contracted. Edda had seconds to act. She moved without speech. Edda took the brother's wrist in one hand and pressed the scrap into it with the other. Keep this hidden until the reading, she said. Give it to a man you trust, and ask him to take it to the square when the name is read. If you cry out here, Ambrose will seize and burn it. The brother paled. You trust me? He asked. Edda's face showed no rhetoric. She had no luxury for speeches. If you do not act, Niccolo will be dragged at noon. Act instead of witnessing. He slipped the paper into his tunic. His fingers curled around the folded cloth as if it were a live thing. He bowed and left. Ambrose kept his composure, but the narrator noted a change. Ambrose's authority now required assertion. He strode toward the door and called for the reading to proceed. We will not be moved by rumor, he declared. The town needs closure. Bring the public ledger. We read at noon. Within the final hour before the reading, Edda made one more deliberate move. She took a duplicate parchment she had copied weeks earlier and planted within it a small amendment. A notation in the same cramped hand she recognized in the margin earlier, suggesting a prior alteration. She coated the duplicate with a light smear of ink to make it appear aged. Then she tucked the duplicate into the archive wrap that Ambrose used for the official copy, counting on Ambrose's habit of sending 2 ledgers, one to the square and one to the archive, so that the public ritual would still proceed, but the duplicate might later be used to expose alterations. When the time arrived, the square filled. Men shoved forward. Children watched from behind the crowd. Torches blotted the dawn light. The jailer mounted a low platform and unrolled the public ledger. Ambrose stood by with an iron, leaned expression. He read Matteo's name aloud, and the crowd repeated it. The syllables traveled like a bell. People began to move toward Niccolo Ferri's house. The physical energy of the crowd turned names into movement and movement into threat. The brother in the crowd clutched Edda's scrap inside his tunic. He hesitated, then pulled it free and called out, "Stop!" The single shout drew eyes. The brother thrust the scrap to a friend and said, "Take this to the magistrate. Tell them the ledger is altered." The man ran. Ambrose glared. He barked for order, and warders moved through the crowd to intercept the runner. For a moment it seemed the ritual would continue, and the crowd would be diverted only by force. Then the magistrate, a man known to be cautious, raised his hand. He had the duplicate copy Edda had hidden in the archive wrap. He opened it and read the marginal note. A different hand, a corrected name, and a notation indicating the entry had been altered after sealing. The magistrate looked at Ambrose. "Explain this," he said. Ambrose's face twitched. He tried to claim clerical practice, to reduce the notation to a clerical change. The magistrate would not accept the explanation. He called for a halt and summoned the jailer to produce the sealed wax, and the men who had observed the initial confession. The square's momentum stalled. The narrator recorded the sudden retraction of the crowd's movement as a concrete, external reversal. Ambrose reacted with fury. He accused Edda openly now. Perhaps because the evidence could be framed as her meddling. She altered the archive. He cried, "She forged my hand!" The crowd murmured. Some faces turned away from Ambrose. Edda stepped forward, hands visible and empty. "I copied what I saw," she said. "I copied the marginalia. I am the scribe. I recorded the truth or tried to preserve it." Her voice was clipped, precise. The words were not a plea for mercy. They were a factual statement delivered into a tribunal of men. Ambrose's response was immediate and swift. He reached for the iron-bound rosary and struck the low platform as if to reclaim attention. "This is sacrilege," he said. "You would fool the town with lies. We must search her person and the archive." He signaled warders. The magistrate stepped between them. He was a man who wanted stability more than spectacle. He looked at the duplicate, then at Ambrose, then at Edda. "We will not seize anyone without cause," he said. "Bring forth a witness who saw Edda change the sealed ledger." His voice called for proof instead of performance. The brother who had come earlier moved forward. He lifted his chin and said, "I was at the market. I saw Matteo taken. I saw the man who touched him. I came here to say the wrong name had been used. I can swear the confession was coerced." His words shift the burden. The magistrate listened and then ordered a pause in the execution. Ambrose's authority eroded in public as a result of the brother's statement and the duplicate. He glared at Edda and then at the crowd. He retreated to a posture of legalism instead of ritual certitude. "If there was alteration, it will be proven by inquiry, Ram Ambrose. We will examine hands and inks. We will not be misled by rumors. But we will also not let an accusation derail justice." The magistrate called a small hearing. Edda produced the hidden scrap and placed it under the magistrate's scrutiny without drama. The ink matched older handwriting. The conversation in the square turned from ritual to investigation. Men began to speak less as worshippers and more as citizens weighing evidence. The momentum that had marched to Niccolo Ferri's house stalled and then reversed. The crowd's movement dispersed into groups that debated and pointed fingers. Matteo's fate shifted with the crowd. He was pulled back from the execution bench into guarded custody pending the inquiry. The warders tightened their grip on him, but the physical motion now felt different. It was not a march toward death, but a custody toward a court hearing. Matteo's shoulders fell. He let out a breath that might have been a sob, but which the narrator recorded as the sound of a man releasing pressure. In the aftermath, Ambrose retreated to the chapel while the magistrate ordered a review of past entries and witnesses. Edda returned to her desk and removed the remaining duplicates from the archive wrap. The narrator noted that Edda had traded secrecy for exposure. She had risked her station to produce evidence that altered the public record. The ledger lay open on Ambrose's desk when the chapel door closed, and the iron-bound stylus reflected the thin light through the slit. The final act of the chapter resolved the immediate conflict. The scheduled execution did not take place that noon. Matteo was held for questioning rather than executed. Niccolo Ferri was spared from a mob at that hour. The twin records, the public ledger with Matteo's coerced entry and the hidden scrap that revealed alteration, introduced a durable tension between sanctioned ritual and buried truth. The narrator catalogued these facts and then drew one last concrete image to close the scene. Edda slid a folded scrap under a loose flagstone in the alcove floor, pressed it flat with the heel of her hand, and then tamped the stone back into place so that no one would notice the seam. She marked the spot with the nick of a quill on the shelf above the desk, an ordinary scratch that any scribe would take for a tool notch. Ambrose, unaware, set the public ledger in the chapel chest and walked away. Matteo was led to a cell where he pressed his forehead to the cold wall and whispered his brother's name. The narrator recorded the ledger's stain and Edda's hidden scrap as evidence of both coercion and quiet resistance. The chamber doors closed. The public record and the private counter-record now existed in parallel. The final movement of the chapter was practical and concrete. A flagstone slippered back into place, a name whispered against cold stone, and the slow closing of the chest that held the public ledger. The scene ended with a single decisive action, Edda's fingers drawing the quill's nick above the shelf. so that listeners would leave with a precise image anchored to the chapter as events.